The morning at the Pig family's house began as usual. Mummy Pig was making breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper, and George was playing with his toy dinosaur. Peppa laughed as she colored her drawings with bright crayons. On one of the sheets, she drew herself with a big red circle on her nose and a wide smile. "Look, George! It's me, a clown, Funny Peppa." George giggled, but when Peppa hung the picture on the wall, she thought for a moment that the smile on it had become wider than she had drawn. That evening, when Daddy Pig turned off the television, Peppa noticed a strange reflection in the glass. In the place where she stood, the reflection seemed to smile a little wider. Her eyes looked larger and her mouth stretched upward, as if someone had pulled it by invisible strings. "Maybe I'm just tired," Peppa mumbled and went to bed. That night she woke up to the sound of quiet laughter. It was muffled, coming from somewhere below the floor. Peppa looked around. Everyone was asleep. Only a faint light glowed from the hallway. When she stepped out of her room, she saw herself. Her own reflection in the mirror by the stairs, but not quite. The reflection had a painted clown smile and dark circles around the eyes, like smeared makeup. Peppa stepped closer, and the reflection blinked first. She stumbled back and ran to her bed, hiding under the blanket. She didn't open her eyes until morning. The next day, Mummy Pig noticed Peppa acting strangely. She barely spoke and kept staring at the mirror in the living room. When Mummy asked if something was wrong, Peppa only said, "I don't feel like myself." That evening, while washing up before bed, Peppa looked at her reflection again. Her cheeks seemed brighter than usual, as if someone had drawn red circles on them. And when she smiled, her mouth didn't stop stretching. The skin around her lips strained, but the smile kept growing wider and wider until it was too wide. She slammed the faucet shut and ran to her room. That night, George woke to a quiet humming. A faint light was coming from under the door. He got up and peeked into the hallway. Peppa was standing in front of the mirror. She slowly swayed her head side to side, whispering rhythmic words. Her reflection moved slightly faster than she did. There were dark streaks on her face, like melted makeup. Her smile was wider than a face should allow. George softly called her name, but she didn't respond. She just turned her head toward him, and her grin twitched to the side, as if pulled by invisible strings. The next morning, Peppa seemed unnervingly calm. She barely blinked and quietly hummed the same tune George had heard in the night. Mummy thought she might be sick, but when she looked closer, she noticed red stains on Peppa's cheeks and a faint line of paint at the edge of her lips. "Peppa, have you been playing with makeup?" "No, Mummy," Peppa said, staring straight into her eyes. "It's not paint." That night, the lights in the house went out. Daddy Pig grabbed a flashlight and walked into the hallway. He froze. Long, smeared streaks covered the walls, like someone had dragged their hands through wet red paint. At the end of the hallway stood Peppa. In the dim light, her face looked white as chalk, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "Peppa," Daddy called. She stepped forward. The beam of the flashlight caught her eyes. They were empty, without pupils. The smile didn't fade. As Daddy took a step back, Peppa slowly raised her hoof and drew it across her cheek, leaving a red line, as if completing her own mouth. "Peppa, stop!" shouted Mummy Pig, but the little girl was already gone, swallowed by the dark. The next morning, everything looked normal. The house was clean. The walls were white again. Only on the mirror in the living room, someone had drawn 2 red circles and a wide, stretched smile. George stood staring at it. In the reflection beside him, Peppa appeared. He turned around. The room was empty, but the reflection was still smiling. Now, with the face paint of a clown. Late at night, Peppa and George were still awake. They sat on the floor of their bedroom, building a tower out of blocks and laughing. Outside stretched the darkness, the wind rustling through the branches of the trees. But suddenly the room grew colder. At first, just a faint draft, then an icy current of air that made the toys on the shelves begin to sway. "Peppa, I'm scared," George whispered. The toys began to move. Cars rolled across the floor on their own. The teddy bear lifted its paw, and a doll tilted its head so sharply that its neck cracked. Peppa pulled her brother close and felt the walls begin to change. The drawings on the wallpaper came alive. Flowers stretched into black, writhing lines like shadows, creeping slowly upward. The bedroom door creaked and swung open. A silhouette appeared on the threshold. It looked like Daddy Pig, but twisted, like a reflection in a warped mirror. His body was covered with green growths, like avocados, and his arms were massive and powerful, like those of a gorilla. His eyes glowed a dim red. This was the avocado gorilla. He leaned forward and spoke in a deep voice. "Let's play a game. Stay absolutely still until morning. Any movement, and you lose." Peppa and George froze where they were. In the corridor behind him appeared the figures of Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig. But they were not their parents. Their faces were lifeless, their smiles too wide, and their eyes were empty, black voids. They stood motionless, staring directly at the children. The house began to distort. The ceiling rose higher, the walls stretched, and new doors appeared, doors that had never been there before. One opened on its own, revealing only fog and the sound of heavy footsteps. The air grew thick and cold, and the lamp overhead flickered as if it were breathing in rhythm with Peppa's heart. "I can see you," the avocado gorilla said, his voice echoing as if from inside the house itself. "Whether you stand still, whether you breathe too loudly, I will notice." George gripped his sister's hand so tightly, Peppa's fingers turned white. She didn't dare move. It seemed the shadows on the walls were watching them, waiting to catch even the slightest twitch. Minutes dragged on endlessly. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind sounded like thunder. Time itself felt frozen. Peppa knew that if she flinched even once, the game would end, and the end would be terrible. When the clock hands finally crept past dawn, the figures began to fade. The avocado gorilla slowly dissolved like smoke. The shadows sank back into the walls, and the drawings on the wallpaper turned ordinary again. The room returned to normal, but Peppa and George knew it hadn't been a dream. It was a test. The next morning, their parents acted as if nothing had happened. Mummy made breakfast. Daddy read his paper. Peppa wanted to ask about the night, but stayed silent. They remembered nothing. Or maybe they simply didn't want to. A day later, the family went to Grandpa Pig's farm. Peppa was excited about the trip, but unease gnawed at her. From the very moment they approached, she noticed everything was different. The trees seemed taller than before, their branches weaving into a heavy canopy. The ground was soft, almost damp, and every step released the smell of rot. The farm was silent. The usual chatter of animals was gone. The barn was empty, the shed stood open, but inside there wasn't a sound. Even the ducks on the pond sat motionless, like statues. Grandpa Pig greeted them with a smile, but his eyes were strange. In them glowed the same red light Peppa had seen in the avocado gorilla. "Welcome," he said. "Today we'll play a game too." The family stood in the middle of the yard, surrounded by fog. The houses and trees around the farm seemed to blend together into one vast living creature. Peppa felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, and in that trembling she heard the familiar breathing of the avocado gorilla. She squeezed George's hand and realized the game was not over. Their home, their farm, their world, it had already changed. The avocado gorilla was watching them, and now he was everywhere. A gift for George. George really wanted a new toy. His favorite dinosaur had broken, and the boy was sad all day long. Mummy Pig decided to cheer up her son and took him to a new toy store on the outskirts of town. The store was strange. Dim lighting, creaky shelves, and the shopkeeper, an elderly pig with cloudy eyes, spoke very quietly, almost in a whisper. "Choose any toy, dear," said Mummy Pig. George wandered between the shelves, looking at bright toys, but his gaze was drawn to one special figure in the far corner, a small creature with big dark eyes and a wide smile. The tag read Labubu. "I want this one," said George, pointing at the toy. The shopkeeper looked strangely at the boy, then at Mummy Pig. "Are you sure? This toy is special. It requires special care." "What do you mean?" asked Mummy Pig. "Nothing special, just be attentive to the child's behavior." Mummy Pig shrugged and bought Labubu. George was delighted. He hugged the toy to himself all the way home, and Labubu seemed to look directly at him with her motionless eyes. At home, George immediately ran to his room to play with the new toy. He sat Labubu on the bed and began telling her about his favorite games. "You'll be my best friend," said George. And then it seemed to him that Labubu nodded slightly. The first few days everything was normal. George played with Labubu, carried her everywhere, even slept, hugging her. But gradually his behavior began to change. First, George became very quiet. He stopped running around the house, shouting and laughing. Instead, he sat for hours in his room, quietly talking to Labubu. "Who are you talking to in there?" asked Peppa, peeking in on her brother. "With Labubu. She tells me interesting stories." "But it's just a toy, George." "No, she's real. She talks to me." Peppa looked at the toy. Labubu sat on the bed with the same wide smile, but something about her pose seemed wrong to Peppa, as if the toy was watching her. Then George began saying strange things. He told his parents about a dark forest where Labubu lived, about other children who played there forever. He said that Labubu showed him this world in dreams. "I like it there," George said with a distant look. "It's always dark and quiet there. And no one shouts." His parents became worried. George began avoiding sunlight, preferring to sit in dark corners. He stopped eating his favorite food and barely slept at night. One night, Mummy Pig heard George talking in his room. She quietly approached the door and listened. "Yes, Labubu, I understand. I want to stay with you forever. Your world is much better." Mummy Pig entered the room. George sat on the bed holding Labubu in his hands. His eyes were wide open, but his gaze was empty, as if he was looking through his mother. "George, who are you talking to?" "With Labubu. She says she'll take me to her place soon. We'll play in her world where it's always night." Mummy Pig felt a chill. She took Labubu from her son's hands. The toy was ice cold, even though George had been holding it in his warm hands. "I think you need to rest from this toy for a while," said Mummy, and took Labubu to another room. George screamed like never before. He cried and begged to return Labubu, said he couldn't live without her. At night, Mummy Pig woke up to a strange sound, quiet footsteps in the corridor. She left the bedroom and saw George walking toward the room where Labubu lay. The boy moved strangely, like a sleepwalker. His eyes were closed. "George!" called Mummy, but the boy didn't react. He reached the room, took Labubu, and returned to his room. In the morning, he didn't remember how it happened. The parents decided to get rid of the toy. They took Labubu back to the store, but the shopkeeper only smiled mysteriously. "She'll return," he said. They always return to their children. And indeed, the next day, Labubu was back in George's room. No one knew how she got there. Each day, George became more distant. He almost stopped talking to his family, spending all his time with Labubu. His skin became pale, and his eyes lost their shine. One morning, the parents went into George's room to wake him up, but the bed was empty. Only Labubu lay on the pillow with her unchanging smile. George was nowhere to be found. The search continued for weeks, but the boy seemed to have vanished into thin air, and Labubu remained in the house, waiting for the next child who would want to play with her. Early in the morning, Peppa Pig's family set out for a picnic in the enchanted forest. Daddy Pig carried a heavy basket of food, Mummy Pig held George by the hoof, and Peppa ran ahead, promising to find the most secret place. On a meadow by the stream, they spread a blanket and laid out the treats. George already reached for the cake, but Daddy gently reminded him. "Vegetables first, George." After lunch, Daddy suggested hide and seek. "I'll count to 100, you hide." Peppa and George darted behind an oak and held their breath. But when they peeked out, there was only silence. No steps, no voices, even the stream seemed hushed. The sun leaned toward the horizon, and the forest grew unfamiliar. They tried to find the meadow again, but every path led back. Every tree looked the same. Darkness fell quickly. In a rock, they found a low, damp cave and hid inside. It smelled of moss and moisture. George whimpered and Peppa whispered, "We're together. We'll manage." Then branches cracked outside, closer and closer. In the darkness, 2 red sparks flared. They did not blink. They were old tales of the deer monster. Its antlers parted branches, its steps shifted paths. A growl burst from the dark, shaking the ground. Peppa grabbed George. "Run!" They bolted and saw a light ahead, an old hut among the thickets. They rushed inside and slammed the crooked door. The air was heavy, the walls rotten. In the corner lay a chest, a rusty shovel and axe. Outside, something circled the hut and pressed against the threshold. Then the walls shook, struck by huge antlers. "Make noise," whispered Peppa, and they banged on the pot and the chest lid. A guttural roar answered, and the door cracked. Moonlight fell through a hole in the roof. The children pushed the chest, climbed up, and scrambled onto the roof. Below, antlers scraped the walls. A thick branch of an old tree stretched nearby. "Jump!" cried Peppa. They clasped hands and leapt. The hut collapsed behind them, but the red eyes glowed again in the mist. On the branch they froze. The forest seemed to breathe. Far away flickered a warm light like the glow of their home. "Home!" George said with relief. They climbed down and ran. The wind carried scents of apples and wet bark, but suddenly from both sides came, "Peppa!" "George!" The voices were familiar, yet echoed with a delay. The light drew near, then slipped away. At last, they saw their house. The door opened. On the porch stood Mummy Pig. "Where have you been?" We were worried. Beside her was Daddy with a checkered blanket. In the kitchen it smelled of pie. The kettle whistled. "Vegetables first," Daddy said, and George nodded. They embraced, but Peppa noticed strange details. Mummy wore a different apron. The clock ticked oddly. Dry needles stuck from the rug. "We got lost," Peppa whispered. "Now you're home," Mummy replied, and the phrase seemed to echo faintly. That night, Peppa woke. Outside the window wasn't the yard, but forest. The moon hung between branches. On the glass lay a thin shadow shaped like antlers. "He found us?" George muttered in his sleep. In the morning, all looked normal. Daddy read the paper, Mummy set the plates. But the door opened not to the path, but to a narrow trail among spruces. On the windowsill lay 2 pine cones. In the hall remained wet prints shaped like branches. "Did we come back?" George asked. "Of course," Mummy smiled. Her smile was warm, but her lips seemed to repeat the motion again, like a reflection in water. By day, they tried to walk into the yard, but after a few steps, the path curved and brought them back to the porch. "It happens," said Mummy. The word echoed faintly. In the evening, Peppa saw a note on the fridge. "Vegetables first." Beneath it stretched a scratch, splitting at the end like antlers. At night, the house creaked like wood, smelling of resin. From deep inside came slow, endless counting. In the morning, Mummy said, "Today we'll stay home. The forest is tired." Daddy nodded. The mat by the door grew damp. Beneath it, roots were pushing through. "Home is good," said Peppa. George smiled. In the glass, their reflections doubled, as if two more stood beside them. Then the shadow blurred, and antlers lay across the pane. Since then, at night, the house smelled of forest. Sometimes trees stood outside the window. Sometimes the yard returned. No one spoke of the cave or the red eyes. But each time, Daddy said, "Vegetables first." A very close voice repeated the same words, with a delay. The deer monster no longer chased them through the thicket. He was already inside.
A scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The familiar yellow walls seemed darker somehow, and the cheerful pictures on the wall appeared to be watching her with their painted eyes. Peppa rubbed her eyes and looked again, but everything seemed normal now. Downstairs, Mummy and Daddy Pig were having breakfast as usual, but they weren't talking. They sat in complete silence, their eyes fixed straight ahead, chewing their food with mechanical precision. When Peppa said good morning, they turned their heads toward her in perfect unison, their smiles too wide, their eyes too bright. George was playing with his toy dinosaur in the corner, but the toy wasn't making its usual roaring sounds. Instead, it seemed to whisper something that Peppa couldn't quite understand. When she moved closer to listen, George looked up at her with eyes that weren't quite his own. They were darker, older, as if something else was looking out from behind them. The telephone rang, and Mummy Pig answered it with that same unnaturally wide smile. She spoke in a voice that sounded like hers, but felt wrong, agreeing to meet someone at the playground. As they prepared to leave the house, Peppa noticed that all the clocks had stopped at exactly 12 minutes past 3. At the playground, all of Peppa's friends were already there, standing in a perfect circle around the slide. Susie Sheep, Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and all the others stood motionless, their heads tilted at the same angle, their smiles identical. They began to speak in unison, their voices creating a strange harmony that made Peppa's ears ring. The playground equipment began to move on its own. The swings swayed back and forth with no one on them, the seesaw rocked up and down in a steady rhythm, and the roundabout spun slowly, creaking with each turn. The children continued to stand in their circle, their eyes never blinking. Peppa tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, as if she was moving through thick mud. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps, all perfectly synchronized, following her at the same steady pace. No matter how hard she tried to run faster, the footsteps stayed exactly the same distance behind her. She found herself back at home, but it wasn't quite right. The yellow house was now a pale gray color, and the windows were all dark, even though she could see lights moving inside them. The front door opened before she could reach it, and Daddy Pig stood there with his arms outstretched, welcoming her home with that same too-wide smile. Inside, the family sat around the dinner table, but there was no food. They all stared at Peppa as she entered, their heads turning to follow her movement. The silence was broken only by the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking much too loudly. As night fell, Peppa lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the house. But instead of the familiar creaks, she heard whispers coming from the walls themselves. The voices were soft and constant, speaking in a language she didn't understand, but somehow felt she should. By the end of the week, Peppa stood with her family and friends in the same perfect formation, her head tilted at the same angle as theirs, her smile identical to all the others. The whispers had become a comforting lullaby, and everything was exactly as it should be.
It all started the day Peppa found a strange toy in her room. It was a Labubu, a small yellow monster with big black eyes and sharp teeth. Peppa couldn't remember where it came from. "What a cute toy!" "Where did you come from, little one?" she asked. Labubu remained silent, but his black eyes seemed to follow Peppa's every movement. That same day, a second window appeared in her room. The new window was old and dark, completely different from Peppa's usual window. Through the murky glass, instead of the familiar yard, there was a view of a gloomy, foggy forest. And strangest of all, in the forest grew trees that looked exactly like Labubu toys. "Mummy, look at this window and this strange forest," Peppa called out. But Mummy Pig replied, "Peppa dear, there's only one window in your room. And what's that toy you're holding?" Mummy couldn't see the second window, but even stranger, she couldn't see the Labubu toy either, even though Peppa was holding it right in front of her. On the first night, Peppa placed Labubu on her bedside table and went to sleep. But in the middle of the night, she woke up to a strange sound, the quiet grinding of teeth. In a quiet, creaky voice, Labubu whispered, "Peppa, Peppa, look out the window." You can talk," Peppa gasped. She turned to the second window. In the forest, she saw hundreds of small yellow figures, exactly like her toy. They stood between the trees, staring directly at her. Every night, the army of toy Labubus in the forest grew larger. They moved closer to the window, and their black eyes glowed in the darkness like little stars. "We've come for you, Peppa. You found us. Now we'll find you," Labubu said. "What do you want from me?" Peppa asked fearfully. "We want you to become one of us, forever," came the chilling reply. On the third night, Peppa woke up to find her hands had turned yellow, like Labubu's, and her eyes in the mirror seemed bigger and blacker than usual. "What's happening to me?" she cried. "You're becoming one of us. Soon you'll be able to live in our forest and we'll play forever," Labubu explained with a sinister smile. Peppa tried to throw away the Labubu toy, but it always returned to her room. She tried to close the second window, but it appeared on other walls. "Mummy! Daddy! Help me!" she screamed. But her parents couldn't see Labubu or hear his voice. To them, Peppa was just talking to herself. On the seventh night, the Labubu army came right up to the window. There were so many of them that the forest glowed with the yellow light of their bodies and the black gleam of their eyes. In chorus, they chanted, "It's time, Peppa. Time to join us." Peppa looked at herself in the mirror. Her skin had turned completely yellow. Her eyes were big and black, and the same horrifying smile as Labubu's appeared on her face. I'm ready," she said in a voice that now sounded like Labubu's. The second window opened by itself. Cold wind from the Labubu forest rushed into the room. Peppa, now looking more like a toy than a pig, stepped toward the window and disappeared into the night. In the morning, Mummy Pig came into Peppa's room to wake her up, but the bed was empty. On the windowsill lay only a small yellow Labubu toy with big black eyes. "Peppa, Peppa, where are you?" Mummy called out. She picked up the toy. For a moment, it seemed like Labubu winked at her and whispered quietly in a familiar voice, "I'm here, Mummy. I'll always be here." A week later, George found a strange toy in his room, a small yellow monster with big black eyes. And that same day, a second window appeared in his room. "Dinosaur! Dinosaur!" George exclaimed. "No, George, I'm Labubu, and soon you'll be Labubu too," the toy replied. In the forest beyond the window stood a figure that looked very much like Peppa, but with yellow skin and black eyes. She waved at George and smiled with Labubu's horrifying smile. Be careful with toys that appear out of nowhere. Sometimes they don't come to be played with, but to turn you into a toy. The night was unusually quiet. Outside the window, there were no stars, no moon, only a dense darkness in which everything seemed to dissolve. Peppa Pig's house had fallen silent on its own. Even the kitchen clock had stopped ticking, and the silence was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against their ears. Peppa woke up suddenly, as if someone had touched her shoulder. She sat up in bed and listened to George's breathing. It was too even, too quiet. Her brother slept, tightly clutching his dinosaur. But then, from the parents' room next door, came a sound. A low, drawn-out groan mixed with a creaking noise. Peppa held her breath. She hadn't wanted to wake George, but he opened his eyes himself and looked at her. His face was pale. He had heard it too. Carefully, they got out of bed and, trying to walk silently, stepped into the hallway. There was no moonlight, only a faint flicker coming from under their parents' door. That was where the strange sound was coming from. Peppa squeezed George's little paw. The door was slightly ajar. She nudged it open just a little and peeked inside. What they saw froze their hearts. On the bed sat a creature that resembled their parents, yet was entirely alien. Its body looked as if it had been stitched from two halves. One part, Mummy Pig, the other, Daddy Pig. Two heads protruded side by side, but the eyes in both faces were utterly empty. They reflected no light, no life, only two bottomless black voids. Identical, wide smiles stretched across both faces. The creature turned toward the children, the two heads tilted at the same time. With that movement, the very air seemed to change pressure. It became harder to breathe. Peppa stepped back, but her legs refused to obey. George clutched her paw tightly, but he too seemed rooted to the floor. The creature stretched its arms toward them. The fingers were too long, the joints bent at unnatural angles. The room reeked of dampness and rot.
Mama,
whispered Peppa. But in that moment she knew it was not their parents. Their bodies began moving on their own. Slowly, step by step, they walked toward the thing. Their hearts pounded, but there was no strength left to resist. The creature waited. Its two mouths opened and closed in perfect unison, but no sound came out. And that silence was more terrifying than any scream. And then, from behind it, from the very shadow, he appeared. Labubu. Peppa recognized his silhouette instantly, her favorite toy, the one that always sat on the shelf. But now, he was alive. His movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His red eyes glowed in the dark, and on his face was a smile so wide and crooked it looked as though the fabric would split. In his paws, he held a doll. Small, ragged, and horribly familiar. A copy of Peppa herself. Even the dress was the same pink, only stained with dark blotches. Slowly, Labubu began to pull at the doll's head. The fabric stretched, and a sickening tearing sound filled the air. The two-headed creature immediately froze, as if awaiting orders. Its empty eyes were fixed on Labubu. It wasn't the master, it was the servant. "No," whispered Peppa, but her voice was too weak. George flinched, his small eyes widening. On the floor beside him lay another doll, an exact copy of George. It had appeared out of nowhere, and its lifeless eyes stared directly at the children. Labubu lifted his gaze. His red eyes met Peppa's. In that instant, she felt the world itself shift. The walls of her parents' bedroom quivered, the ceiling stretched higher, and the door behind her slammed shut on its own. There was no way out. The creature took a step forward, its two heads grinning in the same unnatural smile. But it wasn't moving toward the children. It was moving in rhythm with Labubu. Every tilt of his head, every twitch of his paw was mirrored by the monster. It was the puppet, and Labubu was the puppeteer. Peppa and George screamed, but their voices vanished, swallowed by the air itself. Labubu only smiled wider. He lifted both dolls, the Peppa doll and the George doll, and pressed them together. At that moment, the children felt their own bodies being dragged forward, pulled into the darkness toward the creature. The darkness closed in around them. Peppa had just enough time to see Labubu's red eyes blazing brighter than ever. And then the world was gone. The last thing that remained in her memory was his smile, and the realization that now they themselves had become part of Labubu's collection.